absolute monarch, billionaire, car collector, and one of the richest men on earth who answers to no one. Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah rules Brunei with unlimited power, owns a collection of vehicles worth billions, and lives in a palace so vast it has 1,788 rooms. He's accumulated wealth that most nations can't match, implemented laws that the West condemns, and built an empire of luxury while his subjects live under strict Islamic law. But is it oil wealth that built his fortune, or something darker about how that money flows? Today on Enigma, we're going beyond the palace gates to uncover the real Sultan of Brunei and the secrets hidden in his garages. The numbers are staggering, but most people have never heard of Brunei, a tiny nation on the island of Borneo, smaller than Delaware, with fewer than 500,000 people. But beneath its rainforest sits one of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, and sitting atop that wealth is one man who owns it all. Not in the way a CEO owns shares, but literally owns it. The oil, the gas, the land, the people. Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah isn't just head of state, he's also prime minister, defense minister, finance minister, and supreme commander of the armed forces. He is the government, and everything the nation earns flows directly to him. The car collection is where the excess becomes visible. 7,000 vehicles. Not 700, 7,000. Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, McLarens, Bugattis, custom-built models that don't exist anywhere else. Gold-plated supercars that have never been driven. Entire warehouses filled with vehicles that sit gathering dust because one man couldn't possibly drive them all. Former employees who've worked in the palace garages estimate the collection's worth at over $5 billion. That's just the cars. Not the palace, not the private jets, not the investments, just the cars. But here's what makes it disturbing. While the Sultan amassed this collection, Brunei remained one of the most restrictive nations on earth. Sharia law implemented in stages starting in 2014, punishments including amputation for theft, stoning for adultery, the death penalty for homosexuality. International hotels boycotted, celebrities condemned it. And through it all, the Sultan remained silent, implementing laws that seemed designed for another century while he lived in luxury that belonged to the future. Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah was born on July 15, 1946, during British colonial rule. His father ruled with British oversight. Young Hassanal was educated in Malaysia and Britain, attending the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. He learned English customs, Western military tactics, and the ways of British aristocracy, but he also learned something else: how colonial powers extracted wealth from small nations. And when he returned to Brunei, he had a plan. On October 5, 1967, his father abdicated, and Hassanal became Sultan at age 21, inheriting a nation with significant oil reserves but limited control. Foreign companies were extracting the oil, paying royalties, but taking most of the profits. Within years, Hassanal renegotiated contracts. Brunei would take a larger share, much larger. By the 1970s, as oil prices exploded globally, Brunei's revenues soared. And because Brunei had no democracy, no parliament with real power, all that money flowed to one place: the Sultan. In 1984, Brunei gained full independence from Britain. The Sultan became absolute monarch of a sovereign nation. He immediately made himself prime minister, and then defense minister, then finance minister. There was no separation of powers. The Sultan was the state, and the oil revenues, which by now were massive, belonged to him personally, not to the nation in trust, to him. The car collecting started in the 1980s. At first, it seemed like typical rich person behavior. A few Ferraris, some Rolls-Royces, but then it accelerated. The Sultan wasn't just buying cars. He was buying entire production runs. When Ferrari built a limited edition, the Sultan would buy 10, 20, sometimes 50 of them. When manufacturers created special models, they'd offer them to the Sultan first because they knew he'd pay any price. Former employees at Ferrari and other luxury manufacturers have described the process. The Sultan's representatives would arrive, usually his younger brother Prince Geoffrey Bolkiah, and they'd place orders that seemed impossible. "We want 500 custom Bentleys, all painted gold." And the manufacturers would scramble to fulfill them because the Sultan paid in full, upfront, no questions asked. It wasn't about driving the cars, it was about owning them, about having what no one else could have. The palace where these cars are stored is called Istana Nurul Iman, the largest residential palace in the world, 2.15 million square feet. Inside are 1,788 rooms, 257 bathrooms, a mosque that can hold 1,500 people, and a banquet hall for 5,000 guests. The garages are underground, climate-controlled, spread across multiple buildings. Some wings contain cars that have never been started, still wrapped in protective covers. 0 miles on the odometer, worth millions, just sitting there. But the excess didn't stop with cars. Prince Geoffrey, the Sultan's brother, had his own collection. A yacht called Tits, with tenders named Nipple 1 and Nipple 2. A private 747 covered in gold. And according to lawsuits filed in the 2000s, a lifestyle that burned through $50 million a month. When the Asian financial crisis hit in the late 1990s, even Brunei's vast oil wealth couldn't sustain the spending. The government sued Prince Geoffrey, alleging he'd embezzled $14.8 billion. The case revealed a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and assets scattered across multiple continents. Geoffrey eventually settled, agreeing to return assets, but the full accounting was never made public. And that's the pattern with Brunei. Everything is opaque. The Sultan's personal wealth is estimated between $20 billion and $28 billion, but nobody knows for sure because there's no transparency. The nation's finances are controlled by the Sultan personally. There's no independent audit. Oil revenues go into accounts that he controls. How much stays in Brunei? How much gets invested abroad? How much goes to personal luxury? It's all secret. Then there's the question of where the cars came from. Not which dealerships, but how the purchases were structured. Some investigators who've looked into Brunei's finances have found unusual patterns. Large payments to European manufacturers that don't match official import records. Cars that were purchased but never registered in Brunei. Vehicles that seemingly disappeared after being bought. Only to turn up years later in private collections with unclear provenance. Because here's what nobody talks about publicly. When you're an absolute monarch with access to a nation's oil revenues and no oversight, car purchases become a way to transform national wealth into personal assets. You pay a manufacturer $50 million for 100 custom cars. The manufacturer gets $50 million from the government of Brunei, but the cars go to your personal collection. National funds became personal property. And because you are the government, it's not even technically illegal. The 2014 implementation of Sharia law brought international attention back to Brunei. The Sultan had been quietly living his life, collecting cars, building palaces, but the new penal code was extreme. Stoning to death for adultery, amputation for theft. George Clooney called for boycotts of Sultan-owned hotels. The Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles. The Dorchester in London. Virgin Australia ended partnerships. Celebrities condemned the laws. The Sultan's response was muted. A few statements about respecting religious traditions, but no real defense. No reversal of the laws, though enforcement was later described as suspended. But here's what was strange. While implementing these strict religious laws, the Sultan maintained his collection of Western luxury goods. It seemed contradictory. Implementing medieval religious law while living in modern excess, unless the laws were never about religion, unless they were about control, because that's what absolute monarchy requires, control. The Sultan maintains power not through democratic legitimacy, but through a combination of oil wealth and strict social control. The oil wealth keeps the population comfortable enough not to revolt. There's no income tax in Brunei, free healthcare, free education, subsidized housing. As long as the oil money flows, there's no pressure for democracy. But the strict laws ensure that dissent is impossible. Criticism of the Sultan is illegal. Political parties are banned. Free speech doesn't exist. Media is controlled. And the harshest laws keep people scared. They send a message. Step out of line, and the consequences are severe. It's not about enforcing religious morality. It's about maintaining a system where one family controls everything and nobody can challenge them. Former palace employees who've left Brunei and spoken anonymously describe a surreal existence. The Sultan has multiple wives. Though Islamic law limits men to 4, former wives receive settlements and were quietly moved abroad. Staff members who saw too much were transferred or dismissed, often with generous payouts and non-disclosure agreements. The palace operates like a separate world, its own rules, its own economy, and at the center is the Sultan, who controls it all. The car collection in this context becomes less about passion and more about power. It's a statement. Look what I can have. Look what you can't. Each car is a reminder that the Sultan operates by different rules. He can buy 50 Ferraris while his people live under laws that prohibit basic freedoms. He can own more wealth than most nations while enforcing punishments from the Middle Ages. And nobody can stop him because in Brunei, he is the law. There are whispers that some of the Sultan's wealth has been moved in anticipation of future instability. That offshore accounts have been established, that properties have been purchased in countries with strong property rights protections. Because oil doesn't last forever. Brunei's reserves are significant but finite. Production has already peaked. Within decades, the oil money will slow. And when it does, what happens to an absolute monarchy built entirely on oil wealth? Some analysts suggest the Sultan is preparing for that eventuality, diversifying, investing Brunei's sovereign wealth fund in assets around the world. But here's the question nobody can answer. Is he investing for Brunei's future or for his family's future? Because when the oil runs out, the Sultan and his family will still have their cars, their palaces, their international investments, but what will the people of Brunei have? The Sultan is 78 years old now. His son, Crown Prince Al-Muqtada Billah, is being groomed to succeed him. The transition will likely be smooth. The system is designed for it, but the fundamental question remains unanswered. How did one man accumulate so much? Yes, Brunei has oil, but so do other nations, and their leaders don't personally own 7,000 cars. The difference is governance, accountability, transparency, things Brunei doesn't have. You will never meet the man who owns 7,000 cars. He lives behind palace walls, surrounded by security, isolated from the world he rules. But his collection sits in underground garages, a monument to unchecked power and unlimited wealth. And whether you see it as the legitimate privilege of a sovereign or the grotesque excess of an absolute monarch depends entirely on whether you believe one person should have the power to own an entire nation's wealth,